You might like, I was going to use some headlines kind of phrases to break up some of my continuation of, if not actually telling you the only new creation myth in the last 2,000 years, still me talking about what it might be like had I told you. I want to pick up some of where I was last time that we were taping in that same regard. And if all questions of what seems to be directions of the movements of individuals and humanity, such as evolution or involution or progress or retroactions, if all of those are actually unthinkably irrelevant. For those of you taking notes in English, I intend that to mean much more in a more manifold fashion than moot. Moot just doesn't get it. Moot's just irrelevant, but it's unthinkably moot. That is, that all of these questions reached that plateau, if indeed movement itself is the only dependable, vital sign of life. Now, if you could take life, if you were checking on its health, and you could get outside the system itself, rather than humans having all sorts of, or at least more than several, more than one, vital signs that a physician will check, I'm suggesting to you, at least in this context, that there is only one dependable, vital sign of life itself, my suggestion, and that might be movement. Forget movement this way, movement that way, movement. Now, if that be so, let's just try to bring you up to date where we were talking about last time we were taking. If that be so, then consider historically there's always been this idea, very serious idea, of an indispensable trinity. In all religions, philosophies, and me, even throwing into you for a long time now, the idea of a third force, the tertium quid. What if all of that was simply an attempt to keep you, a few people, but to keep you from engaging in that useless folly of trying to choose sides in that eternal, necessary dichotomy? Now, I'm not saying it's not true that there is a third force, that there is like the C force compared to what seems to be the struggle between things trying to move in this direction and things trying to move in that direction. And then I continue to point out that there's always been a kind of low-level knowledge, sensation, that there is a third aspect. And if you try to talk about it, the only way you could describe it to ordinary intelligence is say, well, it's everything that's not involved with this particular conflict. It's like the all-encompassing temporal milieu of everything, but of this specific problem. But what if all of that is almost itself unthinkably irrelevant? And it's not even important if there is a third possibility, if there is this disinterested third aspect. What if that is simply to keep you from engaging in the silliness, the uselessness, not of all of humanity, but a few people, of having to choose sides, of even trying to think, well, wait a minute, this is obviously progress. And then maybe even think you're getting better, like, well, now I could be wrong. Because what is progress to the Pilgrims could have been bad news to the Indians. What seems to be things pressing forward to the conquistadors could have made many of the Aztecs go, whoa, mama. No. What's happening to the neighborhood? So you could even be trying to get philosophical at the ordinary level and think, well, is it not quite that easy as to whether one of these forces, one of these directions, is all that good? That in toto, this is a good move. It might be a little otherwise. What if all of that was my opening suggestion to you last time we were taping, that it's not important? What if it's beyond not being important? And the whole idea of, wait a minute, there's there's a secret, there's an ordinarily unrecognized third possible force, third alternative reality, third possible direction. I'm not saying there's not, but can you hear me for a second? that it could be that all of that was simply misdirection. This is getting very, right? That it's no longer, we'll assume that by now, after all the bad influence I've been on you, that on a good night, you're not all that caught up at your best intellectual level as to whether that maybe your nervous system, your own brain immediately says, yes, well, I approve of that. That would be a good move on humanity's part. And, of course, going in the other direction would not be. So let's assume that by now, on a good day, your brain would do that, and you would try and say, well, it might not be all that certain. I could just be falling into the general flow of how life wants people of my ilk to think. So it could be open to further discussion. And all of that sounds as though you're on the way to some more expansive viewpoint, insight, which I'm not saying it's not. But what if you can short circuit? What if the whole reason of me bringing up, trying to wrap up a decade for some of you people with this new creation myth, which I thus far don't seem all that inclined to come right out and tell you, but remember, if you connect the dots and do an outline around something, finally people of some real view, some real insight, can go, oh, shadow plays, 5-dimensionally though. So what if it's not in any way necessary, absolutely necessary for a person to even go through the continual process of, well, there may be some validity to that view, but wait a minute, I should at least back off, worried about the opposite, not be totally wrong, totally right, 30% right. What if you could bypass all of that? Which you cannot do ordinarily. You cannot do. There is no way you can take ordinary intelligence and say, well, wait, here's a situation that seems to be detrimental. Here's an immoral situation. Here is a kind of warfare going on where innocent people are being slaughtered. Now I'm talking ordinary intelligence. Are you going to let me tell you that may not be unsavory, at least, much less immoral? Are you going to listen to that? Are you going to hear me hint that, wait a minute, there may not be anything wrong with that, of destroying millions of people? Are you going to abide that? There's no way you can. Now, some part of you may go, well, you've got to mean that by now. I've got enough faith in this and my own experience thus far that you got to mean something allegorical. It's just, I don't know what it is. I just can't follow it. Forget all that. The ordinary nervous system cannot tolerate that. It can't use that information. It's simply not wired up to. And if you found a person here and there, which you could, that would say, hey, I agree to that. You know, all you've got again is Hitler or a Gaiseric or an Attila reincarnated. In other words, you do not have mainstream humanity. You do not have a healthy manifestation of life if you found somebody that agreed that, yeah, wiping out 1 million people over here, that was a good deal, or at least there's nothing wrong with it. The middle class, the bell curve of humanity, is not in any way wired up to tolerate any sort of information that sort of activity is good. And of course, I'm not saying it is good. But what if it's not a matter of whether it's good or bad? The ordinary intellect cannot go any further than that, because it would say, again, well, you're either trying to hide some kind of bloodthirsty philosophy, or else you're speaking so allegorically that chipmunks can't even figure it out. But see, the subtle part is, what if it's neither one of those? That's what I'm trying to hint at. I consider this possibility. Can you hear this? Now I'm going to use some specific nouns, words, but could you even perceive the possibility that it might be better to live in Beirut than Bucharest? At least before their untimely dispatch, I'm sure from his viewpoint, of their recently expired president and his wife, his dear wife. But assuming this was several weeks ago, to keep the alliteration going, could you perceive that it might be better to live in Beirut than Bucharest on this basis? And if you don't like Bucharest, since they're now enjoying a certain kind of, as they call it, freedom, Addis Ababa. The point, Beirut, I'm using that as a place that right now, and has been for several years now, seems to be non-stop fighting. They just slowly and quickly destroying the whole city that one time was called, in your lifetime, the Paris or the Mediterranean or the Middle East. And now the place is just one big ghetto, and they've done it to themselves. And you see, kids are getting up early in the morning, brushing their teeth, and going out shooting at each other. But can you perceive of the possibility that it might be, now of course you're going to have to put this in quotation marks, and I'll go a little further, because we're still not talking about some sort of hidden or allegorical, gory, bloodthirsty philosophy of some kind. But can you perceive of it being better to live in a Beirut than it would be in a Addis Ababa, a place that almost nothing is going on? Life is just stagnated. But people do not get up and run the possibility of being shot or caught in the crossfire of 12-year-olds with Uzis shooting at each other. They may face the possibility of starving to death or dying of ennui. The point is, can you perceive of the possibility of it being better to live where the action is? Almost, period. Live where the action is, almost, period. Could you conceive of the possibility that it could be more pleasant, which is more profitable, to be living in an area of conflict? I can change it. How about Belfast? How about Northern Ireland? They're right there in one place that it might be more profitable to live there. Where there was some movement going on. And this in disregard to how it may appear to outside non-participants. That is, that let us assume that every one of you would be middle class and sane enough that if I said, how would you like to live in Northern Ireland right now? And you went, no thanks. And if I said, well, what does your old nervous system, your old brain tell you about that? And you would, very likely, say something along the lines of, what a shame, what a waste of life. They're the same basic genetic background, and yet just because of a little historical something, some unpleasantness back a few hundred years ago, you have them divided up into Protestants and Catholics, and they're killing each other and wiping out whole generations and having to put up barricades, and oh, how terrible. I can't imagine. And you would probably feel fairly close to them as opposed to many other parts of the world, because they speak the English language and they're the same, as I said, Anglo-Saxon background as most of you, and you'd think, it just seems terrible. That's an outside non-participant. And I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not encouraging anybody to go move there. You don't see me moving there. But as opposed to some other possibilities, can you perceive of it being even better to live in an area of conflict? If you can't, and this is not a psychological reality of some kind, it is not an individual reality, although locally everyone has their own concept of what's going on. But I was simply going to point out that little pieces of this slip out historically. That there's thousands of years, right up until today, there's been people here and there, not necessarily using examples I did of Northern Ireland, but people pointing out that large segments of otherwise sane humanity actually enjoy warfare once they're into it, in battle. And that many otherwise seemingly sane, decent, civilized men will come out of wars later, and after a drink or two, will admit that they kind of miss it. That life does not have the same spark, the same edge to it as it did when they're out there crawling in the mud and dodging bullets. And, in other words, living in a Beirut, living in a Northern Ireland. Not that that's the proof of what I'm saying, but I was just pointing out, as always, men always know more than they know they know. Mine, the reason I'm bringing this out is still not unconnected, in case you lose your place with the brand new creation myth that I have not specifically detailed. But if it is a matter that it is not of any consequence, it is no profitable division to be made by a revolutionist, even verbally, into is this direction good, is this direction bad, is this partially good, is this partially bad, is it good under these conditions and bad under those conditions, is it good under from this relative view and bad from that one? The answer to all of those is, of course, yes and no. I mean, everybody understands that by now. What if you can get past that? Not just verbally again, but I'm trying to short circuit you partially verbally, or to show you how, that if as long as it's moving, that a Beirut, as terrible as it seems on the news, and I'll assume you've all seen the news, they just wrecked the city, wrecked their society, wrecked their cultures, wrecked their family lives, that from one view, but not any human view, and not any verbal view. What I'm talking about now is beyond the differentiation of saying that this view is separate from some other view. I'm just having to say from a view because it's something that you don't normally do. So by a view, I'm talking about like in a future, from a more complex level. But from one view, it would be more profitable to life, not the individual, to be living in a Beirut than it would be living in some place that I was trying to exemplify by Addis Ababa. Just, you see some of these, Lagos. It's going on a lot in some of the African cities, some of the large ones now. They'll show films, and there's a city that looks fairly modern, and it's like nothing works. I mean, if you want to take this kind of retro idea of the Blade Runner movie, if I got it right. But here it is, they've got traffic lights, they've got highways, they've got a few skyscrapers, but it turns out that the electricity is only on maybe 2 hours every week. The elevators don't run, traffic lights don't work, there are people just sitting in the street. And it's got nothing to do with culture, it's got nothing to do with the nationality, it's got nothing to do with the area. I'm just picking out where it is right now that is somewhat in tune with when we're taping this, of circa 1990. But to be in a place that, in other words, let's assume that you are safer day by living in a Lagos or in a Addis Ababa, that you're safer living there. Very, very unlikely you're going to be shot compared to living in Beirut. But do you understand, it might be more profitable to life, and to some individuals, although that's still not the point, to be living at least where there is some movement. The only reason I'm going through all of this is to try and get you to feel more and more that this kind of information is available in life, that it may be simply from an ordinary view, that is from ordinary intelligence's best view, that it may not be any question whatsoever, forget moral, political, even forget intellectual, if you can, of it being that this movement is superior to that movement, that peace is preferable to war, that one is preferable to, that green is preferable to down, that brown is preferable to left, that height is preferable to 16, that all of that is unthinkably irrelevant. Remember, not just moot, just unthinkably irrelevant, because as long as something's moving, that's the vital sign of life. No matter what, here's a paragraph heading. Some of these you could take down, although I wasn't using that kind of picturization for the immediate future of my funny rules of physics. But no matter what paradigm, no matter what system is used, or attempted to use, here's the heading, here's the law. The human mind, the human intellect, cannot define, cannot determine what actions or what thoughts are truly life-supporting and which are not. I guess I could shorten the sentence. I don't want you to mistake that I'm telling you a funny, actual law of physics. No mind, no human intellect, I don't care who you ever think did it, who you think can do it now, even if you thought you have done it, you are wrong. No mortal mind can determine what is profitable and what is not. That's just it. And I happen to know the smartest person I know. And this person has never done that. It's not that you may not know otherwise, but your ordinary mind cannot, and that's the one that speaks. So nobody, there is no exception to this. If one guy, if a colossus, a historical A Moses stands on one corner of the earth and says, such and such is good. And on an opposing quadrant, a Confucius stood up and says, no, such and such is. There's no place to scratch your head or to go, well, I'll weigh this. And it's not that either one of them's wrong. But it's not that either one of them's right. Nobody, no human intellect, can determine what is life-supporting, what is healthy, and what is otherwise. It's just, that's it. They cannot. The human brain cannot under any ordinary conditions. No one can, no one ever has, no one ever will. That also, I was going to lead you, produces what seems to be the eternal frustration, the folly involved that is inherent in man's continuing inability to reach any kind of unanimous decision. That is, nobody can determine, is it better that we call off the war here in Beirut? Would it be better if we all just became Muslims? And if so, should we all become Shiites or Sunnis? Not Shonnies. Wait a minute. Maybe I've hit something. Have any of you been in a big boy recently and seen the way they treated you? All right. Enough of humor. Let's go back to something funny. Northern Ireland, would it be better that we all, is there some way we could convince, say the Catholics, is there some way that we should convince the Protestants that, look, Luther made a mistake, we won't hold it against you, just straighten up and we can cut out all these wars and tear down the barbed wire? There seems to be no way, and they do it politically. Should we all be capitalists, free market people? Should we be socialists? There is no way, it doesn't seem any closer than ever, and life has parts of his body still acting as critics, wringing their hands saying, what's happened after thousands of years? We don't seem to be any closer to any sort of unanimous voice. We can't seem to agree on what we should be politically, religiously. Of course, inherent in all that is the belief that that would be proper, that that would be good. And there is no sane voice in life to say otherwise. There's sane voices. If one voice says what we should all do is be Catholic, let's say, or we all should be capitalist. Now there are voices that say no. There are voices that say we should not be capitalists, we should be socialists, that we should not be Catholics, we should all be Muslims. So don't get lost there. There is no voice to stand up. There's no part of life that stands up and say, hey, there's no such choice actually extant. So it's not that one of these is going to happen. It's not that we're all going to become Catholic or they're all Christian or all going to become Muslim. That's not the source of the frustration. That we can't decide. The source of the frustration is there is no such choice. That is, there is no such possibility. It's not that we can't seem to bring ourselves together enough to all become one religion. That's not the frustration. Well, some of you thought you had it, and now you thought you lost it. You were right when you started a couple of minutes ago, you had it. It's on the basis that nothing reflected in the ordinary intellect of man, which is that which is verbalized, correctly divides that which is proper, healthy, life-supporting, from that which is not. And it doesn't matter that at some locale that a figure stands up, let us say, to personalize it, that some figure stands up and says, us as a people, we right here need to do so-and-so. We need to do away with about 17 of our gods and get down to maybe 3, and we should stop drinking muddy water, and we should stop killing our second-born female children. And that may be good for that locale, which of course is good for the overall complexity of life. But to say that that is good for life from the human view, you are wrong. But do you follow? It's not that you're wrong. It's just there is no such division to be made. No human mind can do that. And if it may say, wait a minute, it's got to be good for us not to poison ourselves or to commit inter-family homicides. And who's going to say, no, it's very good to kill yourselves. It's very good. Nobody's going to say that. Life is not wired to have somebody say that. That's not the opposition to it. That would not be the tertium quid opposition. The opposition to it, of why the frustration is that, wait a minute, there is no choice between whether we should kill ourselves and our families or not. That's no choice. But don't fall into the trap of saying, so you're seeing the light, you mean we shouldn't do it. No. There is no choice. Take a side note in regard to the possibility of movement being the only vital sign of life. Note this, just out in the ordinary boondocks of humanity, that is, down in the ordinary swamplands of southern New Jersey, of Alabama, out in Bakersfield, down at that level, notice that humanity is driven to continually refer to the potential worth of everyone, even heinous homicidals, at the middle of the bell curve, and even into the more sophisticated areas at the ordinary level of educated, civilized men. They are driven to continually point out the potential worth of anybody, of some serial killer, some guy who's murdered his children or mistreated his children. Notice. Because sometimes they're attacked by another part of life's body as being bleeding heart liberals and all that. But there is written throughout the general genetic makeup of the middle of the bell curve of humanity this professing of everyone's worth, their potential value and worth, of not just totally condemning people who have done unspeakable acts. I bet you don't know where I'm fixing to go with this. Won't take but a second. It was an aside. Notice, humanity is driven to speak of the potential worth of anybody, comma, as long as they're moving. To expand and to update Dante's imagined entry sign, all hope is abandoned for only one group of people, the dead. As long as there's no sign of action, until there is no sign of action, the general middle class of humanity is driven to not abandon hope. That as long as somebody shows any sign of life, which is, they move. If they move, humanity would hold out some hope for Mussolini. Right up until suddenly somebody looked up and realized that's not an Almaco sign. That's you know who. I guess in the midst of celebration and excitement, it would have been possible to pull in wherever it was there in northern Rome and pull up and say, well, give me 5 gallons of El Duce. And then realize that was not one of the Rockefeller's overseas brands. If so, that mug of his was not, I would suggest, a very attractive logo. I don't know. Well, back to something serious and not funny, of course. That was not intended just as humor. Again, as men know more than they know. And don't take it as just being real obvious. Because the middle class, the middle of the bell curve of humanity, are driven under proper conditions, which are generally prevailing, that they will speak. They might put it theoretically, and life will make them condition it and couch the language just right. But here it is. They will speak of the potential profit that everybody, psychiatry still does this, the law does this, at least in the more civilized parts of the world, the more sophisticated, will continue to speak of the possibility of remedial action in some way, through counseling, through religious activities, through perhaps some sort of pharmaceuticals, that almost anybody, dangerous people, can be in some way perhaps rehabilitated. But we'll never give up hope, right until the last. The last what? The last movement. It is an overt, it is a physical reality of humans, these groups of molecular collections treating other groups of molecular collections as having some hope, that is, still being alive, as long as they're moving, even though they're moving over here and they're doing terrible things, or they did terrible things. And here they are, maybe we've got them locked up now, and they're laying on the floor, foaming at the mouth and screaming obscenities and shouting, you know, turn me loose and I'll kill all of you. Humans are driven to still speak as though there is a potential for some benefit to arise from this human. And they don't know why. Oh, they might say, well, we all have our possibilities, and who am I to judge and all that. I'm telling you what it is, or I'm hinting. There's some possibility as long as one thing is taking place. The person is moving. Beirut is moving. Where the action is may be where life is. But I don't have to warn you much more. You have got to see from your own intellectual view, from the old viewpoint, and from all of life's ordinary viewpoints, that that is not any sort of available view. That is not any routine, normal view. It can't be defended. Of course, I'm not trying to defend it. But it's not that being a raving maniac is good. But it's not that it's bad. It's that nobody's intelligence has any ability, not the right. And it's not that you may not have the ability because you don't know as much as me, or that you don't have the right because you don't know as much as Buddha did, or Moses did, or Jesus did, or anybody did. Nobody did. Until the myths became believable, and that's when they became religions. But nobody could look upon this man, and by man it could have been a group of men, it could have been a whole movement, it could have been an epoch of history, it could have been a time zone, laying here, foaming, kicking, screaming, threatening life. No human can look at that and say, well, the sooner that's over with, the sooner he's dead, the sooner those group of people's gone, the sooner this time period is over with, the better. Nobody can do that. Now, life has people doing it, which I'm going to get into, I'm sure not tonight, in the continuing one specific aspect of the creation myth I of course haven't told you, but a part I haven't told you yet that I think some of you will like that, believe it or not, brings to mind mafia families, in case you'd like to think in the future about how a new creation myth might in some way, had I ever actually told it, might have to do with mafia families duking it out. Of course, it'd be real funny if I die tonight and you'll never find out what it was. No one can look at anything going on, not just a thing, but any idea, and make any judgment. I'm trying to close all possible doors. Any judgment as to whether that is beneficial, whether it holds any positive potential at all, or whether it holds none, or whether it holds some and maybe not some, or whether it holds some under these conditions and some under that condition. You can talk forever, which you're supposed to, and you'll never be any closer to abrogating what I'm telling you is a brand new unrecognized law of physics, and that is that no human intellect can tell what's good for life and what's bad. Nobody can. And it doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter if you say, well, that's good, and somebody else will say it's bad. And you say, all right, one of us is right. No. In fact, you're doubly wrong if you're trying to do this, for you to think that there is a response. That you think, well, all right, one of them's got to be true. Or if one of them's not got to be true, wait a minute. I remember what you're talking about a third possibility. You're saying that neither one of them are exactly true, so that's the other possibility, right? No. No, that's why I tried to bring up a creative new creation myth. Now, some of you should be able to go beyond that. Oh, wait a minute. If you're saying that one of them's not right and one of them's not wrong, then the third possibility is in some way, I mean, they're going to kind of merge, or that, all right, the third possibility is that neither one of them's right or wrong. Aha, now I got it. That is progress. But if you're going to make a jump of a decade, that's what I'm doing this for, there's something beyond that. Where the third possibility is unthinkably irrelevant. That it doesn't matter whether this is good or whether this is bad. It doesn't matter whether that's going this way or this way, and it doesn't matter whether you say that's going that way or whether you say that's actually going this way, and the other person says, all right, that's not going this way, it's going this way, and you say, all right, maybe it is going this way and not that way, and they go, no, well, it may be going this way. You can do that forever. You can cut it up into little bitty pieces, and then you can cut it more to where it gets bigger, or then you can try to put it together. Some of the pieces have been cut to where it starts getting smaller again, and you can start throwing it up so that it falls down, and it doesn't matter. In Beirut, you don't know where to look. You don't know who's going to shoot you first. You don't know where it's going to come from, the front or the back. But it might be more alive in Beirut than it is in Bucharest. It may be safer in Bucharest on a local level. You may come out with your ass intact for 60 years, whereas you may not, or at least you may worry you may live 120 stressful years living in Beirut. You do understand, I assume some of you people out on tape, that if you're a real revolutionist, if you've got any business doing this, you don't have to worry about trying to actually get to Lebanon or to Romania, because you got Beirut, the possibility of Beirut, inside of your own nervous system. And you also have Bucharest. How about a long heading? See if I can piece all this together. When the headings are good, I don't know whether you agree with them, it's just my opinion, but hell, I like my opinion. When a heading's good, you can skip the body of the work. You remember what I was doing about the reversible flows of the human intellect acting as a lens for information apparently coming in, going out, and I pointed out to you that the real purpose of the human intellect, if you could see beyond the real purpose, beyond what seems to be the purpose, would be as though a lens and a camera that letting information in, where it can reflect on itself, and reflect on out there, and then it even reflects on itself, but that from a non-verbalizable view that I'm trying to hint about again tonight, there is a kind of lens, there is a future that is available right now, wherein which way the flow goes, unthinkably irrelevant. And the strange thing is, it doesn't matter. It will not affect the cogency of the flow. It will not affect the result, even if you were correct, which you're not. But even if you were correct that said, all right, through this lens right now, energy is going this way, and it's producing one result, I can see it. And everybody around me agrees, and I go, yeah. And my hint, of course, is insane to say, well, that can be reversed. Going to go in the opposite direction. And the same result, the same work will get done. You just can't see it. Keeping in mind that that is the basis of what I was going to try to point to some more. Then if you took the reversible directions, that possibility, that is, remember the reversible direction of energy and it not really mattering, even if you're correct, that energy is flowing in that direction and is producing X result. And everybody says, yes, we can see that. And ordinary intelligence looks at me and I go, well, I can't argue with that. And that says, but wait a minute, you're saying that if it actually turned and went this way, it could be producing, or would be producing, the same result, that you have reversed the flow of energy, and it had no effect on what was going on. Of course, according to how much I wanted to be stoned and humiliated, I might go, yeah, I kind of said that. All right, so that's part, we're still doing the headline of this paragraph. So the reversible flow, the reversible profitable flow, comma, movement is the only vital sign of life, comma, and history. Well, I like it. Let's just stop there. I kind of fattened up the first part, the always profitable reversible flow theory, comma, movement is the only sign, the only vital sign of life, comma, and history. All right, here we go. Are you ready? Now, history is something more than an academic endeavor. Some of you might remember a little Kairoot that I once let go, that some guy mentioned something about I think it was the geography of the mind, and somebody else says, well, by that, do you mean geography is an academic discipline or the actual topography, the actual physical lay of the land? And the first guy went, you mean there's a difference? History. There is history, and then there's academic history. What's the difference? Said the other guy. And the other guy says, difference? You mean there is no difference? I was afraid of that. Okay, well, I'll go on. Consider that a throwaway. Consider that a freebie. All right, here we go. History. Now, maybe I can make some of you, or hint to some of you more about what history, the energy behind it, the reality. But here I go. What if history? Now, you remember the topping for this paragraph. What if history is no less, now I'm going to say God's, but I don't mean anything you think I mean. The closest I mean right now, if you recall from last time we were taping, is God's are your ancestors. Your more simplistic ancestors is what you got to remember. Your more primitive ancestors, not your superiors, not your betters. You are not a step down from the real gods, the reality. Forget the word. Forget any definition you know. But what if history, you got me? What if history would prove to be no less than the gods attempting to reclaim their diminished power? Or at the very least, it's their attempt to verbally at least establish some claim to past glory. And now consider history. Forget an academic discipline, that history is a collective genetic memory. Not cultural, not psychological, certainly not academic, although it has that kind of manifestation, because anything that's verbalized takes on some manifestation that can be labeled as academic or psychological or mythical. Why do people have history? Not at the ordinary level. I've used that as a springboard too many times, you people. History serves all sorts of purposes. It serves one purpose. It would seem to be, if you can follow, like a parallel manifestation of the human intellect anyway, to be able to remember yesterday. So, as to put it crudely, that every day you don't have to keep reinventing the scripto ladder. I wasn't going to say the cliche of reinventing fire every day. Everybody knew that one. You're not going to reinvent the flat tire every day. All right? So that is one way to look at the purpose of history, or those kind of philosophical things about those who cannot remember history are doomed to wear leisure suits. I know, doomed to repeat it. That is, that history at the ordinary level of there being directions is serving a purpose. There's no doubt about that. Forget all that. If you're going to do this, you've got to go beyond that. What if history is getting closer to something else? That is, your ancestors, the gods, your more simplistic parents, that history is an energetic attempt for them to reclaim, to try and reclaim diminished power, because that's what it is. Every generation takes away some of the power from the ancestors, from their parents. The gods now have less power. Every generation of man that comes along, and you don't know when this generations, or when the generations of man started. Those of you that would still be thinking with old intelligence, you would think that even if I'm saying it paradigmatically, that there's got to be, even I must have some kind of idea in mind where the gods split from humans, or vice versa. That here were the gods and they made the humans. Tut-tut. Ooh, super tut-tut. You fail to make such if you make such a distinction. But every time there is a whole new generation of X, let's call X the progeny of Y, then every new generation of X takes some of the power away from Y. And all of your ancestors are not dead, which those of you who are interested in other such things, another side note, I would suggest to you, is the more complex idea behind such, but one that's still extant, is Shintoism. That kind of reverence, almost worship of the dead. And laying rice out. There's no joke, I'm not going to take time, laying out instead of flowers, rice and food out at the graves of the ancestors, as though they're not dead, because they're not dead, just a different time zone. Your ancestors are not dead, the gods are not dead, but every moment that goes by, their power gets weaker and weaker. Now back to where I was telling you. Can you see history as being an attempt, as the voices of what seems to be the backward past, trying to cry out, hey, let me tell you how we used to be. But every moment, their power is diminished. Not completely, not totally. It's a gradual process. If that, wink wink, had any kind of real validity, could you tie that at all to the individual? At the ordinary level, the individual's continual talk regarding himself and his past, if not his past glories. Take that, those of you who heard it, and those of you who heard it, take that in regards to what you were thinking maybe several minutes ago, that talking about history is pretty vague and open-ended. You are history. Not in that cheap phrase, because we all knew that we're all history, but I'm talking about you are the manifestation of history. Why do you talk about? Why are you driven to say anything about blah, 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 what kind of guy you were? The kinds of things that's happened to you. That you personalize the past. You personalize history yourself. As well, yes, I was almost drafted in the Vietnam War. Let me tell you what I did. And it's all a matter. When people are retelling, they are attempting to reclaim a kind of diminished power. Because when you start telling war stories, in the broadest sense, when you start telling what kind of guy I am, what is it always on the basis of? You can hear it generally. The basis is always, in some way, you're verbally trying to reclaim some diminished power. That is, something that happened that was better then. Well, I was more intellectual then. I was younger then. I had more money then. Maybe I was smarter then. Maybe circumstances were better then when so-and-so did so-and-so to me, and I went, ha, blah, 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 and I told them. I don't know, I can't seem to think of stuff like that. It's this kind of idea that the history, ordinary people say things like this, that history, everyone looks at their past through rose-colored glasses, that kind of thing. That everybody thinks the good old days were actually better than they were, that kind of stuff. All they're talking about is history. The energy behind history, me suggesting to you, is the gods, which we're going to have to get into later. The gods, your more simplistic ancestors, to see it as being no less than them attempting to continually reclaim diminished power, because that's the basis on which they're operating. And it's the basis on which you're operating if you're ordinary. The generation after you considers you history. And no matter what you're doing, you are in a sense now playing God, small g, to the generation after you, because you're attempting to reestablish your diminished power. Well, you guys got it easy nowadays. I mean, sure, you got some of these newer groups, but when I was growing up, we had it hard. I had to listen to the damn Beatles, plus walk in the snow. And then the generation of you, so that's nothing. I had to ride in the snow in an American car, as all my parents had, and I had to listen to the Sex Pistols. It's like there was diminished power with each succeeding generation. All right, I can't resist. This is really sticky, but as long as I'm here. If you can get any glimpse of the fact that the past is always more simplistic, can't be proven verbally, it can't even be thought about at the ordinary level, but there is no fall from grace. We did not descend from the gods. We were not driven from paradise. We were not thrown from some great cosmic Godhead and splintered off into smaller pieces of less consequence. The opposite's not true, but we can't go on with this forever. You've got to be able to get past that. But if you can even see the beginning of this, that the past is always more simplistic. Always. That is why your ancestors, that's why the gods, in a sense, if you can see afterwards, if you can see a kind of five-dimensional history, is why I sometimes divide it and say there's forward history and backward history, because that's not the past. That's just part of it. But if you can see that, then you can see that we are, right now, no matter who you are an improvement. You're a more complex version of the gods. You are always a more complex version of the past, even if you are Mussolini's grandson with an IQ of 50. You are more complex than whatever. Now let's talk about that locality. This one guy I made up, Mussolini's grandson with an IQ of 50. He is more complex than his gods. Don't worry about your gods. Don't worry about anybody else's gods. The gods along the genetic line that produced him, he is an improvement over them. Of course, thank God we don't have time to consider what kind of gods he had, which is an old story. It's an old joke, except none of you people ever heard it. It's about 7,000 years old, except it's in another direction. It's not because nobody's ever told a joke before. But if you can follow that the past is always more simplistic, then can you perceive what I was going to hit at, since I brought up a certain area, that there is no such thing as a living religious past. There is no such thing. As mythically important as it seems to be to humanity, that it seems to be the basis of most of our culture, not just in the West, but all over this planet, that seems to have held things together. It seems to be the basis of morality and civilization. But if you can see that the past is always more simplistic, there is no such thing as a living, or as a powerful, as some kind of worthwhile religious past. It's not just religious past. That's not the only adjective, but I'm just using that because that is where most people seem to look for some kind of spiritual or emotional supplication. Is in some way that is where we should be looking. You look in the wrong place. It can't be. Not if you begin to see that it is always more simplistic. If you pick out a direction, and I won't question it, that you find to be the past, whatever you find to be the past, that's the past. It is always more simplistic, though. But notice, you cannot see that. That is not the way it looks, especially when you get into areas that seem to be religious, spiritual, not ilk. Since it's all based upon, that is, what seems to be a religious past, whatever religion, whatever your genetic system is, whatever your cultural system is, whatever it is that you can apparently look back on, is outdated. It is a myth that is now taken as either believable or unbelievable, which is the same thing. But to make it easy, we're trying to say that which it now seems to be believable. It's no longer a myth. It's now taken as a fact that this is the way things were. This is the way our prophets did. This is the way our people started their religion. It is outdated. It is more simplistic than you are, but notice, at any ordinary level, that completely defies anything that life is built into the general nervous system. It's to look upon, even if you're not that religious, but for a Christian to look upon and to hear me say this and say, wait a minute, you're saying, and I don't even call myself much of a Christian. I only go to church when there's a death in the family and a funeral. But sometimes I think about it, and I grew up that way. But you're trying to tell me that I am more complex than Jesus? Yeah, I can't tell anybody that. They'd go, and for a Jew to say, you mean that compared to Moses, I'm somebody? That I'm what he was wanting to be? Come on. The ancestors of everyone, whether we're talking what you think of as being political, religious, it's all genetics. Everyone's ancestors were more simplistic. There's no way out of it. So if you can see that, there is no living, there is no positive, there is no potent, there is no cogent religious past. What you are hearing about, what you think about, what you read about, what has been remembered historically about religions, the power they had, the people involved, the figures, which is a personalization of the myths, of the energies, consider what I'm pointing out. If you begin to get a glimpse of it, if they had no power compared to you, as weak and as impotent as you seem to be at an ordinary level to yourself, but if you begin to get a glimpse that, all right, taking my sensation of how weak and of inconsequential I am, then if what you're saying is back then it was even worse, then what does that tell you? Other than to have the blues if you're ordinary. What it tells you is this: if there was any purpose and power to the religious myths in the past, then of course they weren't in the past. And if they have any, it's where? That is, it hasn't happened yet. And don't wait for it to happen. Don't wait for the return of the Messiah or the first showing up of the Messiah. Do not wait for the big chicken to leave Marietta and to show up in Bakersfield. The only possibility of the power of the past, the days gone by when things were good, when things were even great, the kinds of things detailed in the opening chapters of the Torah, the days when giants walked the planet, the days of great spiritual fortitude and intellectual insight, connections to the gods, that hadn't happened yet. Oh, it happened. But the way you feel it when it happened, no, that didn't happen. No. But notice how it can go in both directions. What you're dreaming of has not happened. Now, what you're dreaming of happened, but you're an improvement. You're more complex than what you're dreaming of. The degree, the power, the intensity, the complexity of what you dream of as being the glorious past hasn't happened. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen in you. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen in humanity. Not giants, not angels, not sons of gods, not mythical Olympic figures, because they didn't exist. And if they did exist, they were a poor reflection of you. Think about that. And so the reality of what you dream of, I'm saying you didn't exist, but if they did exist, weren't even as good as you are, then your dream of the glorious past is where? Wrong direction. It hasn't happened. Thus I suggest to you, we'll continue for a few more nights, that what you've got again is a drastic turnaround in the perception of what's going on here.